they actually do have elections in North Korea. And Kim Jong-un wins every single election with 99.8% of the vote. I wonder who is the 0.2% of people who didn't vote for them. You'll probably never hear from them ever again. They just disappear off the face of the earth forever. And this is kind of what it felt like when they announced that Mark Carney won 86% of the vote and is now being crowned the King of Canada. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of Zillennial Money. This is episode 52. And we have a little bit of a smaller crowd tonight, but hopefully we can still get through all the stories. Maybe it'll be a little bit of a shorter episode than usual, but I try to jam pack every week, even though this week's been kind of a slow news week. I try to jam pack every week with interesting stuff. So let's get started if everyone is ready. So the first story that I have for us tonight is an update on Bitcoin. So as you guys probably have noticed, the past week we've been just getting brutalized in the market. You know, every time it goes up a little, it goes down even more the next day. So that's been the pattern for the past month or so. And yeah, like a lot of people are asking, when is the bottom, right? Like, or where is the bottom, or when does the pain end? And a lot of people that I've noticed, especially in like, you know, my own life on group chats and stuff, people have been getting so like philosophical lately, right? It's like people questioning the meaning of life, people questioning just a bunch of, you know, just like people getting frustrated, people getting angry, people feeling like dry SpongeBob. You know, that episode of like SpongeBob is like just he's in I think like Sandy's enclosure or something, and he's out of water and he's just waiting, right? So that's kind of what we all feel like at the moment. So where is the relief, right? Like, when could we get some relief? Well, let me show you a chart that can maybe pump your spirits up a little. That shows that maybe, I don't have a crystal ball, I can't guarantee this, but maybe the pain will be at an end soon, for Bitcoin at least. And I would assume for most risk assets in the stock market. Although if you're in like a stock market index, you're only down like 10% from the peak, so you have nothing to complain about, because I know a lot of people that, including myself, that are sitting on unrealized losses of way more than 10%. So let me show you this chart though. So this chart is the M2 global money supply compared to the Bitcoin price. And I do think that they offset the global M2 money supply by 3 months, which is why like it looks like we know what it's going to be already in May. We don't, but you know, usually Bitcoin's price, the idea is that Bitcoin's price, it like lags the global M2 money supply. So M2, if you guys don't know, is basically like all the money that's in cash and savings accounts and just, you know, liquid cash that's available. And this is a global measure. And it's based in USD too. So even if nothing changes, if the dollar drops, the US dollar, then it'll go up. So there's a lot of reasons why global M2 money supply is going up. And there's a lot of reasons why it has gone down, which I'm not going to get into today. But as you can see, since 3 months ago, if we do the 3-month offset, the global money supply has been going up. And if you plot it over the 3-month offset money supply with the price of Bitcoin, you can see that the two are very correlated, right? And I think that somebody ran a correlation analysis, and it was like 80% correlated. So not a perfect one-to-one, but very close, right? Like statistically significant at least. And if we continue to follow the 3-month offset of global M2, then that means that Bitcoin is likely near a bottom. Again, it could wick down to like 75K or 70K even. But I don't think if it does, I don't think it's going to stay there for very long. And the trend or the gravity is working the opposite direction now, is pushing it up if global M2 money supply is to be believed. So this is just an interesting tidbit. Another bullish catalyst, and I always remind people, right, the price, the narrative follows the price. The price does not follow the narrative. And what does that mean? That means that when the price drops, everyone comes up with an idea of why it dropped. It's like, oh, F Trump because it's Trump's tariffs, or F Japan because their bond yields have gone up because of the reverse carry trade or whatever. If you guys remember what happened back in August last year, right? It's always something, but then people always come up with the narratives after the price move has already occurred. People never people never get the narratives right before the price move. They always watch the price move and then come up with a narrative, right? And I see Sunil, you smiling because I know you agree with me on that one. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. But maybe this time, at least for Bitcoin, the narrative will maybe be an indication, or the narrative that Bitcoin is going to go back up will be correct, because I'm watching the state Bitcoin reserve race every day, and every day something, well, not every day, but like every week something happens where a new state introduces a Bitcoin reserve bill, or just a Bitcoin reserve bill moves along committee, or it gets passed in either the state house or the state senate somewhere. And I'm watching the race, and here's the state of the race. Unfortunately, the Utah bill, which was previously the one that was leading, unfortunately that one, it passed, but it kind of got gutted, meaning that they ended up having all these revisions, and they took out the part about the Bitcoin reserve. So although that one did pass, it was not a Bitcoin reserve bill, so it doesn't count as winning. So right now, the Arizona is in the lead, and Texas is coming up not far behind. Either one of those states, I feel like, will eventually pass a state Bitcoin reserve. And I don't know about Arizona, but I hear that support for a Bitcoin reserve is very high in Texas. So I'm very bullish on Texas being either the first or the second state to enact a Bitcoin reserve, but I think they will in the very near future. And by very near future, I mean like the coming couple of weeks or month. So look out for that. But I think that that's going to be one of the bullish catalysts that will cause Bitcoin to go back up very fast and very soon. And moving on, the next bit of good news is that Trueflation. I'm not sure if I'm pretty sure we've talked about Trueflation before on this podcast, but in case you forgot, Trueflation is a third-party independent inflation aggregator. They measure, more up-to-date data, and they have like a better insight, better analysis method than the BLS's CPI or PCE inflation, which is what the Fed watches. So unfortunately, the Fed does not watch Trueflation, but Trueflation is often a leading indicator for where the CPI and PCE inflation will go. And if you look at Trueflation for March so far, it had just fallen off of a cliff. So according to Trueflation, the inflation rate in the United States is at 1.37% right now, which is pretty far below the Fed's target of 2.0, and it's very far below the latest data that we just got from the February CPI, which was 2.8% year over year. And actually today, this morning, we also got the PPI, the producer price index inflation, and it came in much lower than expected. So there's signs that inflation is cooling very much. And yeah, I think that that's going to be a great reason for the Fed to potentially cut rates very soon and very fast and a lot. So that's good news for Bitcoin and risk assets in general. And lastly, just before this show started, I just came across this headline that the Trump administration, according to a White House official, I believe this is Bo Hines, which is one of the deputy crypto people on David Sacks's team. Which David Sacks is the crypto czar. If you guys don't know him, he's also one of the hosts of the All In podcast, which I'm sure many of our audience members are fans of that show too. But yeah, basically, Hines said that that the U.S. government is interested in buying more Bitcoin for the strategic Bitcoin reserve that was just announced. And as well, they're not only willing to buy more Bitcoin, they want to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible. And there's no limit to the size of the US Bitcoin strategic reserve. So it sounds like he's trying to push towards what Senator Cynthia Lummis was saying, which was a bill that would require the US to buy up to 1 million Bitcoin in 4 years. So right now, assuming that all the Bitcoin is accounted for, and I've heard that there's actually some dispute where a lot of the Bitcoin that's in the possession of the U.S. government right now is the recovered Bitcoin from the Bitfinex hack, which if that's the case, then there could be, the government could be obligated to give the Bitcoin back to Bitfinex. In which case they can't use them for the Bitcoin reserve if they're legally obligated to give those Bitcoin back. So without the Bitfinex bag, there's only maybe 100 or 110,000 Bitcoin that's available to be used in the Bitcoin reserve, if that's the case. Which, given what Bo Hines from the Trump administration just said, I think that that's actually maybe even good news, because instead of if they need to buy up to 1 million Bitcoin instead of buying 800,000, maybe now they need to buy 900,000. So they need to give half of their bag to back to Bitfinex, right? So I think that there's a bunch of good news that's just coming down the pipeline, and none of it's really like, we've seen none of the effects yet. We've all just heard of like good news, and then like people don't care because people, like, the market in general is not doing well and there's macro conditions, and I guess like people are not front running the bullishness this time for once, because the macro is bad. But I think that at some point, once all I see is the fundamental improve, right? So at some point, I think that this narrative is going to flip, and then once that happens, Bitcoin will go from 80K to 90K to 100K, and then to all-time highs, I would imagine. But yeah, anyways, I've said a lot. Sunil, let me pass the mic off to you. What do you think of all I've just said? The bearishness that we've experienced in the stock market and crypto market. Do you think that's coming to an end? How long will the pain last? Are we born to suffer? What's your opinion on all of that?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you pointed out. I guess overall, I've always kind of seen Bitcoin as somewhat as a barometer for like global liquidity. But for example, like Bitcoin doesn't like when Bitcoin doesn't shut down, it doesn't close for the weekend. So often, if there's going to be like bad market action Monday night, you usually start seeing it on Monday morning, you start seeing it on Sunday night. So I just think that Bitcoin is a very good barometer for it. So it's not surprising to me that there is this very strong correlation with global M2 money supply. I actually kind of been seeing this chart floating around for a couple of months and was hoping it would end up being wrong, but it ended up being right on the ball when it came to predicting kind of where Bitcoin was going in the near term. But aside from that, the chart actually looks good going forward. So I think that like global M2 money supply did see some like weakness because of dollar strength, but I'm not seeing this being a persistent problem going forward in the next few months, especially considering what we're hearing from the Trump administration and their expectation that rates are going to be coming down. I think that the Trump pump was like purely sentiment, and the crash is also pure sentiment. Like a lot of these things end up being like options behavior in the background and driving sentiment in the market. So for whatever reason, based on the regulatory framework and based on Trump winning, the sentiment in the option markets went through the roof in right after his election win, and that basically caused a blow off the top for the market by the time you got to like late November, and the bull market kind of continued until Trump started talking about tariffs in December. But basically, with any like blow off the top like this, any like options volatility like this, when you see options go in one direction, it means that there's like almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're gonna see a gap fill where things are gonna come down and we're gonna get a correction. So my view is this correction was gonna happen anyways. Like you said, like everybody likes to set narrative in the markets and everybody likes to blame Trump. I've been around for the Tesla game where it's always Elon's Twitter behavior that causes Tesla price to go down when we're in the middle of a crash. But like Tesla and Bitcoin, they're both very highly volatile stocks. So I think they trade similarly. So my view on it is basically that we were going to get this gap fill. Trump basically gave the market the gap fill it wanted by introducing a lot of uncertainty, which has caused the market to start selling off. But institutional investors started holding back as early as December anyways, which meant there was always going to be this moment where the market ran out of buyers and the price reversed. Overall, I think that the macro setup is actually like really good going forward. As you said, this week, like inflation numbers look really good. The true inflation numbers specifically like look amazing. Like they're coming down so fast, it's actually a bit scary. Like what's causing that drop? Is it like you don't want it to be a major deflationary spiral, but then again, it gives the Fed a lot of room. It's kind of happening just as they want to lower rates. So with inflation coming down and a lot of indication this week that we are not getting the sticky prices that might cause another round of quantitative tightening, and we're probably not going to see interest rates go up. I mean, the biggest fear at this point in time that we're not going to get a lot of rate cuts, but with the true inflation numbers and with our CPI numbers this week, I'm starting to think that we're actually going to get the multiple rate cuts that the rate cuts that we deserve as Bitcoiners. I would say that the clear regulatory framework is really good for Bitcoin still. This is something we've been talking about for a while. And I just think that in terms of like global macro, I think that Elon's work with Doge has actually created a situation where the market sentiment in the bond market is actually improving. I think Doge is actually one of the things that's causing interest rates to go down. Along with Trump's uncertainty that he's pushing in the market. But I think that as long as Elon keeps kind of getting wins with Doge, and as long as he doesn't really see like a really strong opposition to it outside of like fear tactics being pushed by Democrats, I actually think that there's a scenario where Doge does significantly change the political conversation in DC. If Elon was to like be able to find $500-600 billion of savings, it's going to be really hard for Congress not to go along with further savings within their next budget and everything. So I just see this being like a major shift in terms of the conversation, which I actually think continues to drive positive sentiment in the bond markets. So I think the 10-year yield is going to keep coming down. And I also kind of anticipate that Trump has given Jerome Powell, because Jerome Powell also pushed a lot of like sentiment in the market, which caused the market to begin to sell off in December too. But like Trump's like abrasiveness and his tariff fight has caused the uncertainty that I believe Jerome Powell kind of needed to start talking about the inevitable end of QT. So like I think if there isn't a solid announcement of when QT ends anytime soon, I think that's going to be another point of another point that's going to actually bring our like 10-year yields down. So I just think that Jerome Powell is getting a little lucky here, that his job's getting a little easier as interest rates are coming down on their own, inflation is coming down on their own, which kind of gives him a lot of room to run. So with the global liquidity improving on top of all the positive things with Bitcoin, the SBR that you talked about, leverage has basically been wiped out of Bitcoin, which means which is also a very healthy thing to happen. And then I guess the last thing I'll talk about is that there's been a lot of talk about like there being a recession because of Trump's tariffs, and also a recession related to Dodge. I mean, my overall view is that if Trump can implement tariffs, or if he's using tariffs as a negotiating tactic and they're not actually going to stick around, or if he implements tariffs and is able to like get some tax cuts for income tax cuts, then it's actually like revenue neutral to the point where it wouldn't actually have a huge impact on inflation overall, I think. So I'm not that worried about the talking point that like that the tariff talk is actually going to cause an inflationary spiral. Even if Trump was to implement tariffs across the board, it would be a one-time inflation, not consistent inflation that will last several cycles. The other fear is that Dodge could create, and it could actually create a drop in government expenditure, which could also cause a technical recession. I just think it's important, though, to point out the difference between a technical recession and a structural recession. Where a technical recession is something where you could see GDP drop as a result of a drop in government expenditure, but the private sector continues to grow. So that's technically could be very bullish for the markets. I see a structural recession as bad for the markets, but not a technical. I don't think it's going to move the markets much at all. So overall, I think the setup is excellent for risk assets and Bitcoin. And as long as global liquidity keeps improving as it has been kind of incrementally over the last year or so, I see the official bull run starting shortly.
Actually, you brought up an interesting point about inflation where, yeah, like trueflation is definitely indicating like a big drop. And maybe like if the drop is too big, then is that maybe not a good thing as well, because it'll scare people, right? I saw a post on X just yesterday morning, I think, when the CPI came out, and people were like, you know, people are so bearish on X these days. It's like it's almost hard to go on there. Where, you know, somebody was saying that like, okay, no matter what happens with the CPI, the market is going to drop, and here's why, right? CPI high obviously is going to drop, right? For obvious reasons. CPI comes in low. Oh, recession fears, market drops. CPI comes in line. Oh, inflation is not going down fast enough because the consensus was 2.9, right? And the month before that it was 3.0. So if it only drops 0.1%, then that's not good enough. Market goes down. Right? If we come in at like 2.8, then you know, it's maybe it's dropping too fast, and maybe we're hitting a recession, right?
So like, sentiment's all news is bad news. That's a good sign for us, I guess, as bulls.
Yeah, like this is how people feel. This is a reflection of how people feel these days, right? Where no matter what happens with inflation or just any type of economic news, there's always a bearish way you can spin it, and the bears are definitely in control right now. So there's not that much you can do, right? So yeah, I mean, and also regarding the CPI, there was also another thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't have time to include in the docket. But if you look at egg prices, that was a thing that was like, I think the report said that it rose 53% or something in February year over year, right? Compared to February of 2024, which makes sense because of like, you know, the avian flu was what caused the mass like slaughter of chickens, which caused the spike in egg prices. But this makes you think, right? Despite egg prices going up like 50% year over year, we still got a cooler than expected CPI report. So imagine that if egg prices didn't go up at all, then like maybe we could have come in at a 2.7. I don't know if anyone's done the math to see like what that effect would be if we take out the eggs. But yeah, I mean, even with the egg prices rocketing, it wasn't. The inflation report was cooler than expected. And by the way, egg prices are also going down, which I'm sure is contributing to the drop in the March CPI. It's not the only thing, obviously, but like I'm sure it's part of it where, you know, the egg prices are now lower. I read today that egg prices are now lower than they were when Trump was inaugurated on January 20th. So it's already coming down to that level. It's still higher than what it is kind of normally, but I think that it'll probably return to normal prices in just like a few weeks or so. So yeah, I think
The egg chart looks like my Tesla chart on my portfolio.
yeah, no,
I think it might be following that.
it looks like all of our portfolios. We
Yeah.
should have shorted eggs if that egg futures. I'm sure a lot of people did that actually.
I'm sure somebody figured it out.
Yeah. Did you ever hear about that like Wall Street bets story? That I'm not sure if it's real, but apparently somebody was like tracking the weather in like South America or something because they were expecting this like huge shipment of these like gourds, which are these like squash like you know plants, right? Like it's like a butternut squash or something, but they call them gourds, and it's like somebody was expecting a huge shipment of gourds to be delayed uh to the United States because there was like a storm in South America, so they like shorted the hell out of the gourds, but then they actually like arrived on time, and they was like the storm didn't really affect the supply at all for whatever reason, and the price of gourds kept on going kept like the or they longed, sorry, they didn't short, they longed like the gourds but then like the gourds actually came on time and then the price fell, and then they lost a bunch of money on like betting on the futures. I don't know. It's like people do all types of like crazy stuff on Wall Street bets, and they bet on like futures based on like the weather patterns of this particular area that produces this farm good. It's crazy, but yeah, I'm sure somebody bet on eggs, and if you shorted egg futures, then you would have made a lot of money.
Yeah, that would have been the trade of the year, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, but I feel like maybe a lot of people got into that trade though. So maybe if it's a crowded trade, then that means that there's actually not that much money in it. But who knows, right? I'm not like
it's usually market makers usually take over these trades before the retail can get in, especially for futures, for sure.
yeah, I don't know about these like degen trades as they call them, but yeah, I mean, I'm still bullish. So that's pretty much all I had on that segment. It's like I know it's painful right now, and if your portfolio has been slaughtered, well, join the club because everyone here has had their portfolio kind of cut in, maybe not cut in half, but like close to that at this point. So anyways, let's move on to our next story, if you're ready. So the next story, let's move on to a little bit of politics news, which is the biggest kind of thing. This is like actually one of, I said this was a slow news week, but this is actually one of the most exciting weeks in Canadian politics in a very long time. We are now sitting on the eve of the end of the Trudeauocracy. And remember what I said about the end of the Bidenocracy, where it was like the movie 127 hours. The waiting for the end of the Trudeauocracy is like a nightmare on Elm Street, right? Like you think that the nightmare is ended, but it hasn't ended, and then it lasts for a few months longer, and then finally, hopefully tonight, it is truly at an end. But I don't know. We might not be getting the win that we're hoping for because we might just be swapping one monster for another, which, we'll have to see about our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, which he is scheduled to be coronated at 11 a.m. tomorrow, Friday, March 14th, Pi Day, funnily enough. I do say the word coronation with intent because in my mind this is a coronation, right? Like this is no different than when King Charles became the king. Like I'm half expecting them to just wheel out a crown and put it on Mark Carney's head. And this is, I asked Grok to generate an image of Mark Carney as King of Canada, and this is what it came up with. And the reason why I say this is because if you look at the Liberal leadership race, Carney won like a super majority of the votes, like 86% or something crazy like that. Those are like Kim Jong-un numbers. Like, in case you didn't know, they actually do have elections in North Korea. And Kim Jong-un wins every single election with 99.8% of the vote. I wonder who is the 0.2% of people who didn't vote for them. You'll probably never hear from them ever again. They just disappear off the face of the earth forever. And this is kind of what it felt like when they announced that Mark Carney won 86% of the vote and is now being crowned the King of Canada. And the Liberal leadership race, by the way, I think only 150,000 people voted. So considering that Canada has a population of 40 million, that's like less than 1% of the entire population voted in that leadership race. So he's becoming prime minister with less than 1% of the vote. So I don't know. I think that that's kind of maybe problematic from the beginning, but I understand that this is the parliamentary system and this is just part of the system and it's not against the rules per se, but it still kind of rubs me the wrong way, which is why I'm going to call Mark Carney's inauguration a coronation instead of an inauguration. And by the way, if you're watching this, it's probably already happened. So you'll be saying hi to Prime Minister Carney instead of Prime Minister Trudeau. And you guys know me, I'm not particularly a big fan of Mark Carney, in case you haven't noticed, right? And I don't say these things without good reason, right? We've talked about some of his gaffes and some of the things he said that are kind of maybe inconsistent in the past, especially with the, building the pipeline thing. He's saying one thing in English to people in Alberta, and he's saying another thing in French to people in Quebec. And then there was also that thing about moving the Brookfield Asset Management headquarters to New York City instead of Toronto, and he was the one that signed off on that, although he's the one that was like pushing and this whole bunch of like anti-American stuff, because being anti-American is like the biggest selling point to Canadian politics right now, right, because of Trump. But yeah, and then also here's a picture of Mark Carney visiting a steel plant, and this is, I don't know if it's I don't think it's the same steel plant, or maybe it is, that Pierre Poilievre visited. And when Pierre visited, he had all the steel workers, the actual workers, just regular blue collar everyday citizens standing behind him for that photo. And I would say he looks pretty natural, right? And then if you juxtapose Mark Carney next to Pierre, I would say that Mark Carney looks mega uncomfortable here. And also, I heard reports that the steel workers didn't want to take a picture with him, or they didn't want to stand behind him. I don't know if it's true, but regardless of whether he just didn't want to take a picture with the plebs, or the plebs didn't want to take a picture with him, regardless, he got a bunch of liberal MPs and politicians. I think that's Anita Anand in the back, and I think Karina Gould is cut off, but she's the one that's standing on the far left, her favorite position, far left. So I think Karina Gould is standing behind him as well. They're all wearing these like really goofy looking work clothes that look super unnatural, and it's like they're all like, I bet it's all their first times wearing this type of clothes in their lives before, because they're all bureaucrats and they've never worked a blue collar job in their life before, especially not Mark Carney, right? As a central banker. So yeah, I mean, I just found this picture kind of funny. There's nothing like particularly wrong with it. I just wanted to share that picture, right? And what I did want to talk about was, maybe just since we're on the topic of Canadian politics, apparently we've also pissed off our second biggest trading partner, which is China, right? So China announced that they're going to impose 100% tariffs on a certain type of seed oil, which I don't want to say that word because it's awkwardly named and I don't want to get demonetized, but it's canola, right? Just call it canola, right? I don't know why it's weird named so weirdly. Canola oil, oil cakes, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's like it's like a step in the process of making canola oil, or maybe it's a cake made out of oil. Whatever it is, apparently it's important and it's a big industry, right? Canola is a big industry in Canada, and other products, other food items like peas, pork, aquatic products, just a random assortment of farm products that China is imposing a 100% tariffs on us effective March 20th. And yeah, they say that this is a response to our tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and steel products. So I believe that we do have a 100% tariff on Chinese made EVs, which is why you don't see Chinese EVs driving around Canada these days, is because we've basically made it pretty much impossible for Chinese EVs to get over here, despite everyone always hearing about how China's EVs are like super cheap, right? And I know people are going to be like, well, they're not up to North American standards. Like, they can make them up to standard very easily, and it'll still be much cheaper than all the options that are available here if they could sell them, but they can't, right? Because Canada imposes a large tariff on EVs. So yeah, there's that story. And then also there was an interview with the industry minister, Francois Philippe Champagne. What a crazy, interesting name. What a cool name. Uh, but with our industry minister, Francois, and he said that Canada will not drop these Chinese EV tariffs, despite this trade war, despite them taxing our canola 100%. So there's that. And I wanted to just highlight the importance, or not the important, but the gravity of the situation that we're in here in Canada, where we're fighting a trade war against our two biggest trading partners, the United States and China. Granted, China is in a distant second in terms of our export volumes, but the United States part is really where it hurts, where 78% of our exports go to the United States, while only 4% go to China. But still, like 4%, it is a noticeable chunk. But yeah, 82% of our exports are in jeopardy after our two biggest trading partner decided to initiate this trade war. So this is kind of the backdrop that the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is going to take over. And yeah, I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to do well, but I would love to be proven wrong at the same time as well. So I'm trying to keep an open mind. But yeah, I mean, it seems like our situation is very tenuous at best with the trade wars going on. So I just kind of wanted to get your opinion, Sunil, on what you think about, first of all, the Carney coronation. Do you consider this a coronation as well? Or what do you think about Mark Carney in general? And what do you think about the particular situation here in Canada that he's going to take over with the trade wars and all this stuff on tariffs, and just your thoughts on being in Canada right now? Are you a happy camper, or are you not a happy camper?
Well, I guess I am a happy camper that Justin Trudeau's gone and he's no longer prime minister. I guess he is until tomorrow morning, but we can celebrate that small point. But in terms of the Mark Carney's coronation, that's what it was. I mean, he got like 85% of the vote on the first ballot. It didn't even have to go to second ballot. So yeah, I mean, the Liberals picked their guy. I think that, I guess, the Liberal move is that they don't want somebody with the baggage of like being one of like Justin Trudeau's top cabinet ministers to be running the party, because that's just not going to win the election. And I think the Mark Carney kind of gives them a clean plate, and then they get to start fresh and maybe even sell themselves as having a fresh start. I mean, I think it's a little weird that Mark Carney keeps talking about how like vote for me to vote for change. They're doing the same line that Kamala Harris did in the US, where it's like, your party's been in power for 10 years. You're claiming that you're the change candidate, but okay, that's confusing. in terms of like I'm looking at the picture of the photo op and everything. I mean, it just looks awkward. That's the best way to put it. At least Poilievre didn't put on a costume when he put his thing on. I don't understand what the Liberals were thinking by putting the MPs behind them. I don't know if they were trying. If they were actually trying to pretend they were workers. I mean, there's clearly two MPs that I recognize right off the bat behind him. So it's just very awkward. But in terms of the tariffs in China, I mean, it couldn't happen at a worse time. I somewhat find it bizarre that nobody is really making any statements or deciding to say anything about this, because we're getting a lot of vitriol about this like anti-Americanism in Canada, and a lot of people are very upset that they feel betrayed by America. And obviously they're our neighbor, and they're substantially more trade is going to America than China. But I do find it weird how muted the country is and how muted our politicians are on this issue, even from the Conservatives. Like, nobody's really saying anything. So I'm not exactly sure why this doesn't seem to resonate with the voters. I guess it's just not like, it doesn't seem to be a part of anybody's strategy to even discuss it. So definitely concerning. I don't know much about the industries. I mean, it's a farming industry. 100% tariffs is concerning. My understanding is that Canada kind of coordinated this move with the Biden administration to put tariffs on US-Chinese EVs. Personally, I look at this and I say, wouldn't it be nice if we had a little leverage over the United States right now? Like, if we already had a deal to bring in Chinese-made EVs into Canada, and potentially even we're talking to the Chinese about building a branch plant in Canada, we might be in a better situation. We might actually have some leverage to use against the United States. For example, Mexico, it's been like widely reported that China is building car plants in Mexico. And one of the reasons why China really pushed for that plan was because it allows them to bypass tariffs and get into the US and Canadian market. Specifically, China wants to get into the US market. So they were trying to bypass trade rules by manufacturing in Mexico and then using NAFTA or USMCA to get the cars across the border. So it was a coordinated effort to kind of like push back and kind of protect our car industry. I've heard a lot of different views on whether it was a good move or not, but I think from a Canadian perspective, it would be nice if we were in a position like Mexico is right now, where we actually had a large country like China offering to make branch plants in our country. One of the reasons why the branch plants in Mexico is actually really important is because if they can't import the cars into America, one of the reasons why American car companies like to manufacture cars in Mexico is because Mexico has a lot of free trade deals, especially like Mexico has a free trade deal with Europe that predates the United States. So by manufacturing cars in Mexico, it actually allowed America to bypass tariffs and get their cars to the European markets with lower tariffs. So China is essentially using Mexico to do the same thing. It's the same play. If they can't get their cars in America, they can get into other markets by using Mexico. I went off on that long tangent just to say that it like our leaders aren't playing the same level of like chess as our counterparts are. Like we're just, it would be so nice if Canada had was a little bit stronger with this in this position and actually was willing to work with other world powers other than the United States. Like, if you look at the chart that you provided with 78% of our trade, it's so clear how reliant we are on the United States and having this asymmetric relationship with the United States. And I feel like our backs are to the wall. I don't think Carney is going to make a statement on this yet. My understanding is that Carney is currently planning on making a diplomatic trip to Europe. So I think that things are a little bit, I don't know why that's important right now. I don't think Europe is capable of saving us from this situation. I feel like we're on our own. I feel like the Trudeau government, predating Carney, has ruined our relationships with the United States. They've ruined our relationship with China, and they've ruined their relationship with India. So those are the three biggest economic markets when you factor by purchasing power parity and population. And Canada is fully reliant on one relationship, the United States, which feels like it's falling apart. I do agree that the tariffs aren't going to be permanent, and Trump's using it as a negotiating leverage to try to force us to a table. But I guess I'll go off on a slight tangent. Like, America has been trading this asymmetric relationships with their allies for years, where they allow people to have asymmetric access to their economy by allowing countries to tariff U.S. goods, but the U.S. doesn't tariff their goods. It happens with Canada, happens with Europe, and I guess the main thing is that like putting myself, if I want to put myself in the perspective of Trump supporters, of like actual mega, I guess the issue is that if America's making asymmetric trade deals with all of their global partners, America might have the United States might have a good reason to do this. They might be negotiating other things like military contracts. They might be negotiating, oh, you sign off on Paris climate, and we'll get you. We'll let you import cars. Sometimes America gets rid of tariffs. So they want their consumers to just have cheaper goods. So there's a lot of reasons why that happens. But the problem with it is that if the tariffs are asymmetric, it means that the American population feels the strain of the tariffs in an asymmetric manner. So like if America can't import Cadillacs into Germany because of the tariff, but Germany is able to import Cadillacs into is able to import Mercedes into the United States, then you have a situation where U.S. Cadillac producers are going to feel a strain on their jobs in an asymmetric manner. So I think that this relationship has caused MAGA, which is a political coalition, which has decided we don't want this anymore. Like we don't want you subsidizing Europe and Canada's militaries anymore. We don't want you subsidizing NATO anymore. We don't no longer want asymmetric trade relationships. We don't care what the reason why you signed up for them. We want to throw it out. So my only question is, how does Canada maintain access to the American market in this scenario where they're trying to force us to the negotiating table and trying to get us to get rid of a lot of our like long-standing tariffs? And I guess the only thing I could really say is that Canada kind of needs its own like Canada First movement. We need to start interprovincial trade, pipelines. We need to stop relying on U.S. infrastructure to move our raw materials. We need to stop relying on U.S. infrastructure and U.S. ports to move our products. We need to get involved in ports, infrastructure, railways. There's all these things. Canada First means we need to build in Canada. We need to be less reliant on U.S. infrastructure. I don't believe that Canada will ever like be in a situation where like the vast majority of our raw materials aren't moving across the U.S. border. But if we had a little bit more leverage and we were able to move our products to a few other countries, we would be in a stronger position while we're fighting Trump on this trade war. And then the other thing is that we have to become more competitive. Like if the asymmetric trade relationships are going away, and we have to pay more money for our own security because Trump's demanding we meet our NATO targets, then Canada's going to have to get more competitive because we're not able to use like an asymmetric trading relationship to benefit our economy. Again, we're not able, like we have a sweet deal being America's neighbor, but America is going to force us to the table and kind of renegotiate the world's trade regime. So I guess my question is that it doesn't seem like Canada is really talking about a lot of the stuff that they need to talk about in order to get ready for this moment where we're moving towards a multipolar world, and America is kind of pulling back on its commitments at a rapid rate because their electorate is kind of forcing them to.
Speaking of Europe, we will have a lot to speak about Europe later, but before we move on to that story, I think that in our private messages, in our group chats, you've talked about the Canadian dairy industry a lot, and since we have a little bit more time than I expected today, because a few people didn't show up to this today's episode, I just want to kind of maybe pick your brain a little, right? So last week, I think, or the week before, we've talked about a lot of how Canada should and could deal with the Trump tariffs in different ways and stuff, and we kind of explored the idea of maybe we should not do retaliatory tariffs. And by the way, before people accuse us of being right-wing conservative shills, the conservatives in Canada are actually also talking about doing dollar for dollar retaliatory tariffs. So this is something that actually all the major parties pretty much agree upon, but maybe we as the Zillennial Money Crew disagree on, because it's like, if we're gonna fight the Americans on a trade war, if we want to continue this fight for longer, maybe we should not retaliate in terms of tariffs, because that means that we'll be taxing our own citizens when we're buying American goods. And why not just buy cheap American goods so that we can keep our cost of living down, and then we can survive, the economic turmoil of the American tariffs for longer, right? So that's, I know the emotional response for people is to do these retaliatory tariffs when maybe long term is unwise. So that was the first thing that we talked about. And then the second thing we talked about is, as I mentioned earlier, the dairy tariffs. I think that Trump himself actually brought that up as a major point of contention, where he wants to, he's saying that Canada is making so much of like the steel and aluminum that we could make here in America, and why are we buying it from them? And they're like ripping us off and all that stuff. And when we try to sell dairy to Canada, they tariff us at 250% or whatever it is. There is like a quotas, right? So I think it's like Canada can import up to like a certain amount without tariffs, but then if it goes over that quota, then there are tariffs. So it's not like 250% for everything, but still, right? Like at some point it does hit the limit, and then Canadian dairy is being protected in that way. And Sunil, I know you have some opinions about our dairy industry, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that. And lastly, you did bring up that fact that Carney is thinking of going to Europe to talk with European leaders as his kind of first act as prime minister. And you said earlier that, in your opinion, that's not the right move. So, what is the right move? Like, what would you do if you were prime minister, or, if Pierre got elected, and what would you say? What would you like to see him do? Or what would you do if you were the prime minister, instead of going to Europe and discussing this with European leaders? Would you go to, try to negotiate with Trump more, or would you go somewhere else? Or what's your opinion on that? So 3 parts, and I hope you wrote them down, because I don't even remember my own questions.
Well, I'll go with the Mark Carney part first. I mean, like, first of all, I'll just address, like, I think he's probably a better choice than Justin Trudeau, like, because he's still a technocrat. I think that there's some benefit to having a technocrat in office right now. I just don't. But like, in terms of like this move to like go to Europe, I just don't think it's the right priority right now. I think Canada is choosing to like stand up for this like idea of like global order and these like world governance organizations, and they want to have like a good relationship with Europe. But I think we just have to be kind of more pragmatic. And like, I'm looking at your chart right now, and Europe basically doesn't register on this chart for like exports for Canada. Like, it's just not our worry right now. We're an export economy. We move 78% of our goods to the United States. They are attacking us. They're bullying us because they can. It's a negotiating tactic. I don't like, a lot of people want to talk about this from the perspective the tariffs are going to stay forever. I don't believe that's going to happen. To a certain point, I would be calling the U.S.'s bluff, and I think that I would not be instituting dollar for dollar tariffs. I think I would actually encourage Canada. I would actually be talking about this from the perspective that like, by like temporarily even lowering our tariffs on steel and aluminum, we're actually making Canadian industry more competitive. I would probably not engage in like what could be considered acts of war, such as like cutting off their electricity and stuff, because they can engage in a lot of acts of war against us. Like, they can cut off our gasoline supply because we refine it down there. So I just don't think that's a wise move to be. And it seems like even like the commentary between when the Howard Lutnick came out, it seemed like they were surprised by how hard Doug Ford went. Like, it seemed like even there was an acknowledgement, let's like lower the temperature a little bit. So I just think at this point in time, I would not be focusing on Europe. I wouldn't be focusing on Ukraine. I wouldn't be coming out with speeches and in the first line calling, making allegations about Trump being like a Russian stooge. I would actually be a little bit more respectful of Trump, because he is the president of the United States, whether we like him or not. And in the end, I would probably be focusing in I guess like I don't know that how the job would work from time to time, but I think I would definitely be focusing on a balance between threatening very specific products, but not this situation where Canada's, I feel like, is digging itself a hole. Like I just think we have to be realistic how we talk about it too, because we're like we're getting our country all worked up. We're getting people all upset. People are saying crazy things like, "Oh, we don't even need the United States. We could just sell to other countries," and they have no idea how reliant we are on this relationship. So I would just kind of like call Trump's bluff, let him do his loudmouth stuff, and in the end, it's probably gonna settle itself out in a couple of months when they make our premier sit down. And I guess we have to be prepared for what areas of the economy Trump is gonna change our relationship with. Like if Trump basically says, get rid of the steel and aluminum tariffs, I'll let you keep supply management, we should be ready to take a deal like that. In terms of the conversation around supply management, I guess it just comes up a lot because it's like a really good example where Canada actually uses tariffs to like protect our industry, like protect local farmers and protect our food industry. But it's a way of like basically we're not protecting necessarily like small like farmers with like 3 or 4 cows. Like these are still fairly big farms. We're protecting a dairy cartel, and we're essentially protecting a corporate milk cartel. And cartels are just bad for consumers. So in a sense, we are using our asymmetric tariffs to protect Canadian oligopolies that are gouging Canadians, where Canadians pay like double the price for dairy in dairy products than most other countries in like the G7. So we're making Canadians pay more money for things like cheese, milk, and butter only because we want to protect a cartel. And I just don't think that's good economics. And I just think long term it's not sustainable. And we probably need to modernize this system. And we probably need to stop making. We probably need to stop engaging in like crony capitalism, where we care more about cartels than our consumers, because our consumers are people. And when you like put an artificial tax on something like dairy, or butter, which are like these are like important goods. These are goods people need to survive. I mean, unless you're lactose intolerant, but these are still like staples, and putting a tax on staples is like a tax on the poor. So I think that there's like a way of like even arguing that like the way that we protect our dairy cartel is actually taxing the poor in Canada.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And by the way, I am slightly lactose intolerant, but I have the lactase pills that I take, which fixes everything. So it's a miracle drug for me. But yeah, anyways, let's move on to our final story because it's actually somewhat related, which in the previous story you mentioned about Carney going to Europe again. Again, I keep bringing that up because I think that Europe is not going to be able to save us. And this story will kind of tell you why. And I am very I respect European people a lot. I think they're very smart and they're hardworking people. But the government of all these European countries are just absolute trash, and they're letting down the people of their great countries, because you'll see what I mean in a second, right? So this was a post that was uploaded by the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who said that Europe has all it needs to take the lead in this competitive race. This month, the European Commission will unveil the European Savings and Investment Union, will turn private savings into much needed investment. Now, that is the real kicker of that post, the real sentence that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way and stroke fear into a lot of people, because what does she mean by turning private savings into much needed investment? So it sounds like she wants to unlock the the savings that people have in bank accounts. If you add them all up, apparently it's up to 10 trillion euros. So that's a lot. If you just you take all the savings that everybody has in all of Europe, including retail investors, even companies and hedge funds and investment firms and whatnot. If you just take all the cash, that's apparently $10 trillion. This is concerning because, well, how are they going to unlock $10 trillion of savings, right? And why are they doing this in the first place? So the reason why they're doing this is because Europe is realizing that, the Ukraine war has not really gone the way that they had hoped, right? Like Russia didn't collapse, and now they've poured, hundreds of billions of dollars into this conflict already. And if they're determined to support Ukraine, which is nice, but that's going to cost a lot more money. And Europe is kind of afraid of Trump pulling out of NATO, which that has been suggested by a lot of not a lot, but by a few Republican people, including Elon Musk. I think actually has voiced some interest in pulling the US out of NATO. And if that happens, Europe is really going to panic, right? So they're trying to ramp up their defense spending, and they realize that they can't do that if they're broke, right? So they need to find money somehow. And Germany, which just had an election, and the new CDU government wanted to pass this huge budget that is going to boost defense spending. And then as soon as that was unveiled, the German 10-year bond yields rocketed, right? And by bond yields rocketing, yields are inversely correlated to the price, meaning that the price of the bonds fell because nobody wants to lend Germany money because everyone's realizing how Germany is way overspending and they're just losing trust in the German government. So that's why they want more return. Investors, I'm talking about people who are in the market for bonds, the investors want more returns for the 10-year bond, and that's why the bond yields rocketed, right? So that's really not a good thing, even though people see green and it's like green is good. Green is not good when it comes to your bond yields if you're the country, right? So the 10-year German bond yields have rocketed, and the German Green Party actually is the only one that's surprisingly standing in between this budget passing, and they're vowing to block it. But they're only vowing to block it because they're complaining that there's not enough climate action initiatives. So the reason why they're blocking it is because they actually want to spend more money, and they're complaining that it's all defense and war stuff, which is great. They don't have a problem with that, but they also want climate action stuff. And it's just a whole mess. The German government, this election, pretty much, in my opinion, again, I'm not German. I don't live in Germany. I've never even been to Germany. So maybe I'm talking out of line here and I don't know what I'm talking about. But from everything I'm seeing, the German government's an absolute mess. And it was an absolute mess before the election. And this election basically didn't solve anything because they're still kind of stuck where they're trying to spend billions and billions of euros. And they're only getting that budget is only getting blocked because the Green Party wants to spend even more billions of euros. So this whole deal with Europe, this is what I'm afraid of, right? It's clear that Europe, I think, is in decline, and I'm sure Sunil, you will speak a lot about that later as well. But what I'm afraid of is that this is going to lead Europe down the path of authoritarianism and control. And what I mean by that is that I'm not just fear mongering, right? Because the European Union has actually published plans to launch a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, by October of this year. So not October of 10 years later, but just later this year, they're going to start the pilot rollout of the CBDC. And in case you guys don't know what a CBDC is, It's as the name suggests, a digital currency that is directly issued by the central bank. And why is it bad? Well, let me just go through some of the reasons why it might be not the thing that you really want to hope to have in your country. Because with the CBDC, what the government could do is do negative interest rates. So you know how if you put your money in a bank, you get paid interest, and maybe it's not a lot of interest, but you do get paid some money for leaving your money at a bank. Well, imagine if that rate was negative, meaning that it costed you to leave your own money in a bank, and they charge you a fee, a negative interest rate for leaving your money in the bank. And you say, why would I leave my money in the bank if they're going to charge me money just to leave it at the bank? I'll just withdraw it all, stuff it under my mattress, right? Well, with a CBDC, you can't do that because it's all digital. How are you going to withdraw it? You can't. So that's a problem. So right now, if they try to do a if they try to do a negative interest rates without a CBDC, then everyone would just rush to the bank and withdraw it, right? But with a CBDC, you can't do that anymore. They could also, for example, I'm not saying that 100% that they'll do all of these things, by the way, but I'm just saying with the CBDC is always a possibility. And with the government, you know, what is a possibility today that they promise that they won't do might just be reality a couple of years later, right? So just think about the income tax, for example. When the income tax was first introduced, the government said it was going to be just, it'll only be affect a small amount of people, a small amount of top income earners, and it'll maybe even be temporary. Maybe we'll just like do it for a couple of years and then get rid of it. And then, you know, it applies to everybody after only a few years, right? So with the dangers of the CBDC, I talked about negative interest rates. Another danger is expiry dates on your money. So imagine every time you get paid, you have 3 months to spend it, or else it just vanishes, right? And by the way, you can't withdraw it, remember, because cash doesn't exist anymore. Because if a CBDC replaces cash, then there's nothing you could do, right? Because it's all digital. So they could put an expiry date on your money. And the reason why they would want to do that is to get you to spend the money so that you can stimulate the economy, right? Remember, they need to unlock private savings, right? How are they going to unlock private savings? By making private savings impractical or just like impossible even, right? And imagine that you're caught speeding, your speeding ticket, the fine, gets directly taken out of your wallet, right? Because they have control over your wallet, right? Because it's a digital currency that's issued by the central bank, and your wallet, which is digital, it has a direct connection to the central bank. So they'll just take the fine out of your account, and then you can appeal, and then it'll take 3 months, and then they'll probably deny you in the end anyways, right? Like, you know how Europeans know how bureaucratic the European Union is. So you can imagine how that would work, right? They could also bar you from buying certain amounts of or certain things. So, for example, you have 100 euros per month to spend on meat because there's a push for people to stop eating meat these days. So maybe for climate reasons, right? The government's going to say eating meat is bad for the climate. You get 100 euros to spend per month on meat and anything labeled meat products, and then if you overspend your quota, then if you hit that limit, then you can't buy any more meat, even if you have the money. So they could impose categories that are banned or quoted, so that you're limited to how much you can buy. And then you're going to have to buy fried grasshoppers instead of meat, right? So this is another agenda item of the WEF. Again, people call me fear mongering. I'm not fear mongering, right? This is actually legit stuff that the WEF, World Economic Forum, which is a lot of the same people that run the European Union, this is exactly what the kind of stuff that they're pushing, right? For people to eat less meat for the sake of the climate, and to replace meat with eating insects as a food source, right? So again, I'm not making this up. And yeah, basically, there's also like privacy concerns, right? the digital euro. They're going to be able to track every payment. They can block purchases. Again, automatic taxes as well as automatic fines, as I mentioned earlier. So yeah, they're going to sell you this as a convenient way to pay for things. And granted, it is probably actually going to be more convenient than using cash. But yeah, like people are not going to see, people who are not watching the issue closely, like us, they're probably not going to see the bad effects until it's too late, right? Like they're going to be like, oh, this digital thing is great. I don't have loose change everywhere, but then you're sacrificing a lot, right? Like again, you're sacrificing your privacy, and they could put all these like authoritarian controls like negative interest rates, expiry dates. All this stuff is would become possible with a fully digital central bank digital currency. So this is kind of the road that Europe is headed down, and I don't like the precedent that they're setting, yeah, for the future. And yeah, I don't know if this is actually going to become a thing, or if Europeans are going to, realize and wake up and push back. But yeah, I mean, toss the question to you actually, Sunil. Like, what do you think is kind of the cause of Europe's decline, if it is in decline? And what do you think about the CBDC thing that I mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean the news. The this is definitely indicative of Europe's decline. Europe has like a weird relationship with the United States that started like after World War II, right? I'm sure a lot of people who like are watching this know the story, but the United States like helped rebuild Europe. The United States helped liberate parts of Europe, and ever since then, Europe's kind of been like a pet project of American elites to like try to encourage them to get along, have like a market of like allies across the Atlantic, and America's always had like agendas to like keep Europe has always had this agenda of like kind of keeping Europe as friend and making sure all the European countries don't go to war anymore. And basically, America's got this weird military relationship where they've essentially subsidized Europe's security in perpetuity. And they've subsidized our security in Canada too. But Europe's in a very specific situation because NATO started as a pact to push back against like Russian aggression or Soviet aggression at the time. And now it's kind of aimless. It doesn't really have a proper use case or a well-defined use case, but it's about Europe's security. But it's been like 70 years where America has subsidized Europe's security to the point where like the first attempt at Europe needing to like rearm itself and to become like become competent in defending itself, they're like they're in need. I mean, first of all, Europe's not in a good financial position, so it's not a good starting place. And the first thing they do is this like turn private savings into investment, which tells me that it's some kind of debasement policy, or somehow they're going to force more savings into bonds and find a way to use that to leverage Europe's, I guess, war debt that they're anticipating that they're going to have to take on. So it's just like a odd situation to see Europe scrambling like this. I do believe, I do agree with a lot of what you have to say about Europe moving towards kind of, I guess you were kind of describing like a dystopian outcome. I'm not coming out and saying Europe's going to become a dystopia, but like they're certainly into that WEF, like paternalistic government, centralization of government type mentality. You're seeing them take a dive into the CBDC. I like see the CBDC as like the government shitcoin cycle, because now like there was a point in time where everybody had a coin for certain use cases. Everybody or there was, this is Bitcoin, this is a new Bitcoin but better than Bitcoin, or this is a coin that's specifically for this use case. And now governments are getting into it, and now it's like we're going to recreate the euro, but it's a digital form euro. And then of course, it's the same thing as the euro. It's not like it's fixed supply like Bitcoin. It's not like it's going to protect their citizens from inflation, but then it gives the governments all these new powers that they promised to never use and then inevitably there's going to be a moment where they find a reason to use it or they find a crisis to use it. So it's definitely not a good trend for Europe. I mean, I feel like I have a little bit of hope that like Europe is just going to kind of like, as it continues to go into decline, eventually their citizens will wake up and stop electing governments that support these kinds of policies. Um, I have a hard time but yeah, like it doesn't like Europe is trying to like act performatively and we're strong and we're going to protect Ukraine. I think like but then like there's always like a part of it that's like weird. Like last week they came up with a plan that was an alternative to Trump's uh, resource deal plan. And in the plan, Europe wrote up all these responsibilities that give to other countries like peacekeepers and stuff. And they gave the sole responsibility of the United States was to pay for the entire plan, to like finance the entire thing. Which, like, for the perspective of like MAGA and a lot of the people who are voting for Trump, like that's a lot of entitlement that Europe has. Like Europe is very entitled to United States money, and I think that a part of that is how Europe has been conditioned over the last 50, 60 years, because the United States has like again and again bailed out Europe, whether it's militarily or financially. And I don't mean this to like piss off European viewers. And like what happened in World War II was, it was a worthy war, and I'm glad Canada was involved in the liberation of Europe against Hitler. And I think that I do support our relationship with Europe overall, but from a Canadian perspective, I can't speak for the Americans. But sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought, but it's very odd how, from a MAGA perspective, from like a Trump supporter's perspective, it would be really weird reading a newspaper, and it would be really weird reading about this news story and seeing how entitled Europe feels to American markets, but also American money to finance their protection. So I guess the main thing is that like this isn't sustainable the way that Europe and America's relationship has been. It may have served American interests at a certain point in time, but that's clearly coming to an end. And I do agree with you that it is kind of concerning to see where Europe's heading, like moving away from free speech but they're not moving away from democracy, but they're definitely like weakening their local democracies in favor of the European Union government, which isn't necessarily a democracy. It's not really elected in the same manner. So yeah, we're moving towards centralization, away from towards censorship, and towards a central bank digital currency, and towards policy, just towards like open policies and debasing European savers. Not and the savers aren't being debased by their national governments; they're being debased by the European central government, which is even more kind of feels dystopian to me.
Yeah, and I would say that they are moving away from democracy, and that's actually not a hyperbole to say that, because they're clearly moving away. A lot of what I've seen in countries like Germany and the UK, the UK left the European Union, but they can't leave the continent, right? They're still part of Europe from a geographic perspective. What I've seen out of the UK, out of Germany, are a lot of these like super weird stories of how people get in trouble for posting racist memes. And I'm not encouraging people to post racist memes, and you should not post racist memes, but at the same time, just being racist alone is protected under free speech, because it is like, it's not illegal to be racist if you're just saying stuff. You might not be a nice person if you say that kind of stuff, but it is part of free speech as well to have differing opinions, right? And a lot of it's like, what is considered racist, right? It's like some people think that this thing is racist, and then another group disagrees, and there's debate as to like what actually, like if you post a meme that's slightly offensive, like how offensive does it have to be to be like considered racist, quote unquote, right? So it's just, I've seen a lot of this stuff where the government is like trying to crack down on these racist memes in favor of, like, in the goal of fighting hate speech, and I just think that that's they're going a little bit too far and they're encroaching on people's rights. But Sunil, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was going to add to that. The point you were just making is that the government's weaponizing like important topics like racism and like sympathetic topics like racism. So they're weaponizing the sympathy around it, and then they're using that to find a way to institute controls. So it's definitely concerning. I don't even know if they're often doing it. I feel like they're doing it and they mean well. Like they don't even realize what they're doing half the time. Like even this policy, like it tells you a lot about what happened. Like how when a policy starts to get implemented through these big bureaucracy, how immovable they are. Like they just have to keep going forward with like their Ukraine policy, and they're going to have to keep going forward with their like debasement policy. So sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second, but my point I was going to add was that like in terms of, sorry, what were you talking about? I lost my train of thought.
No, I was just talking about like the UK and Germany cracking down on hate speech and how that is an example of the erosion of democracy, right? Because the freedom of speech and freedom of religion too, right? I see a lot of the like Western European governments. They've welcomed a lot of refugees from the Middle East and who are predominantly Muslim, and then Islam is kind of elevated to like a higher status almost, because like, you know, you don't want to say anything bad about Islam because then you get labeled as a bigot and a racist, but then you can say whatever you want against Christianity, and it's okay. So like, you know, there's if like a bomb goes off in front of a mosque, then that's a hate crime. But then if somebody, you know, sets fire to a church or blows up a church, then it's just a regular crime, and they don't call it a hate crime or stuff like that. I've seen a lot of stories where there's like this weird dichotomy where you can make fun of Christianity all you want, which is a dominant religion in most Western European countries, right? You can make fun of Christianity all you want, but Islam, that's off limits. You can't do it.
Yeah, I think these are well-intentioned. I think we've talked about some of this stuff before, but where we say like these are well-intentioned policies, but then they end up becoming illiberal. So they're like I remember what I was going to say is that they're weaponizing sympathy, and they end up implementing illiberal policies, which are well-intentioned. But if you make the society more illiberal, you're arguably hurting democracy, like the point you just made. So yeah, Europe is becoming a lot more illiberal. I find the same thing with Canada under Justin Trudeau. I found it became a lot more illiberal. So I guess that's the main thing, is that Europe might like keep some like a shell of their democratic institutions going forward, but like there's an illiberalism that's seeping into this system. A lot of it has to do with the EU, and it has to do with the central government of the EU having so much power over the actual domestic governments. But definitely an illiberal path. Absolutely. It feels very dystopian. Maybe it's just being on Bitcoin Twitter makes it feel dystopian though, because we're influenced definitely by this topic based on our own basically political Bitcoin beliefs. So
yeah, I mean, obviously everyone has their bias, right? I try to look at things from different angles, but the way that at least what I've seen coming out of Europe, I'm not quite a big fan of, let's just say, right? And it's funny that you brought up Justin Trudeau and the illiberalism that's kind of seeped into Canada as well. It's ironic that Justin Trudeau's party is called the Liberal Party, and yet a lot of, as you said, illiberalism has seeped into Canadian society as well, right? Where I'm not sure if you've heard of the what's called the immigration consensus in Canada, where it's like this concept that immigration has always been a consensus topic in Canada, that Canada is a nation that welcomes immigrants from no matter where you are in the world. And that is still kind of the overarching theme of Canada, even to this day. However, there's a larger and larger movement and differing opinion on the issue of immigration in Canada, and it's kind of sad that we've slightly lost the consensus where, because of the immigration policies of the Liberal government under Trudeau, uh, Canada, I think, if you just ask anyone who's either born in Canada or have lived in Canada for the past 10 years or longer before Trudeau came into office, they would probably tell you that, like, hey, we're a welcoming nation, but we've let in too many people and we haven't been really selective enough, because a lot of people are let in under refugee status or international students who can't really contribute to society right away. And I don't want to make this sound like we're letting in like less valuable people or anything like that, but it's just, like, face it, right? Because we have a skilled workers shortage in Canada. We have all these, like, engineer shortage, doctor shortage, shortage in like dentists and higher skilled workers. And I don't want to make it sound like some people are more valuable than others, but I'm just saying, like, there's a certain group of skills that we need, that we haven't really been selecting the people that we're letting into this country from, that, like, from the skill sets that we need to let those people in, right? And we've just kind of opened the floodgates, and we've just let in too many people. And it's not even about like anyone's race or anything like that. It's just, if you let in people, no matter where they're from, they're going to need housing, they're going to need food, they're going to need resources. And if you let in too many people at once, then we don't have enough resources, and that sucks for the people who are native to Canada too. So it's just, we've lost the immigration consensus because of the way that the Trudeau administration has handled this immigration issue. And I feel like it's even worse in a lot of European countries. And I am seeing, like, stuff that's happening in Germany, where Germany has let in a lot of people, especially from the Middle East, as I said, and then that does cause a lot of disruption in society, because even if they're nice people, again, you have to feed them, you have to house them, and the government has to spend a lot of money, and that means less resources to go around for everybody else. And I just see kind of Germany as a microcosm of what would have happened if the Democrats in the States have been reelected. Because I see the CDU, which is the party that's recently been reelected, as just pretty much ideologically identical to the American Democrats. And what's going to happen in Germany, I think you'll see it, what's going to happen in Germany is going to be what would have happened in America if the Democrats have been reelected, in my opinion. Now, maybe you disagree with that opinion, but that's up to you. That's just kind of how I think about things. But yeah, Sunil, what do you think about anything I just said?
Yeah, also, the most recent thing you said. Yeah, I mean, in terms, I think that like Europe is going to engage and like is going to commit and engage in modern monetary policy, which basically the whole world was engaged in, starting with the COVID situation when we printed all that money and we started to take on a huge amounts of debt to pay for the COVID relief efforts, and that kind of started an economic trend called MMT, modern monetary policy, which was implemented everywhere. And it seems like America is moving away from that now under Trump. They're taking a new direction. They're trying to rebase the dollar with Bitcoin. They're trying to lower debt. They're trying to like gut certain types of government programs that they find wasteful. So they're going into austerity. They're moving away from MMT, which is like modern Keynesianism. And I think Europe's going to keep going with MMT, and we're actually going to see these two approaches uh, work parallel to each other, and we're going to be able to see the impact. And the impact that you're seeing already, and America's bond market isn't always comparable to the rest of the world, but you're seeing Europe announcing big, giant spending programs. Their bond yields are going like this, and America is talking about the opposite, and their bond yields are coming down. They're not coming down like as quickly as the German yields are going up, but they're definitely coming down faster than most people would have expected. So That I think that's interesting. I think that your example about mass immigration in Canada, mass immigration in Europe is an example of an illiberal policy. I feel like we were kind of tricked as a populace how these things were implemented, and that's why the people have kind of like lost trust in their governments. And I think that yeah, that's an example of an illiberal policy that got implemented in many Western countries, and I think that a lot of that happened because of influential organizations like the World Economic Forum, these large extra governmental organizations that seems to have a huge amount of influence over the decisions of our politicians. And to the point where every country is implementing the same policies that the people are like basically rioting against.
Yeah, and I was watching like was it like Joe Rogan or something? And he was saying how the term NGO, non-government organization, is the biggest lie that anyone could ever say. Because like a lot of these NGOs, they call themselves non-governmental organizations, but they're the most connected, well connected to like every government in the world that you can imagine, and they're deeply in the pockets of like the people who run these NGOs are like either current or former politicians
or their kids or their wives or whatever.
their family, like people who are deeply connected to politicians, right? So
it's a circular economy. Like the money starts with the taxpayer. Like it starts with the government funds an NGO because they're funding an initiative, and the money just keeps flowing. And it is absolutely a form of corruption. It's just like a form of corruption that's totally illegal because we've like used like the legislature to allow it to happen.
Yeah, and what we've seen with Doge cutting USAID was maybe the first time that I've ever seen anyone go after this like problem with the NGOs and the circular kind of circle of corruption between governments and people who are secretly government but claim not to be.
Well, it feels like a bubble too. Like it feels like it's only upheld as long as governments constantly trickle in money, and it feels like this whole industry is a bubble. Like it feels like our economies, it hurts our economies, like the vibrancy of our economies in the West, because we don't have any skilled labor anymore. We only have experts who work in this non-governmental, in this NGO sector. I mean, that's a huge part of our workforce.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem, but maybe that's a problem that we can discuss another day, because that's actually brings us to the end of tonight's show. I know it's a little bit of a shorter show for tonight, but lots of interesting topics. And I guess Dom didn't show up again. I know he missed last week, but I'll have a talking to him later. But since he is not here, Sunil, you would have to do the outro. So let me pass it to you.
Well, everybody, please like and subscribe the video, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Have a good one.